Right now, though, we're turning our attention to prisons and in particular the situation facing those serving something called IPP sentences.
That is imprisonment for public protection, which was brought in under the Labour government by David Blunkett, designed to detain offenders who pose a significant risk of causing serious harm to the public through further offences beyond their tariff that the crime would normally get. Now, Lord Blunkett now says they were a failure and a mistake. And in 2012, Kenneth Clarke stopped IPPs from being imposed in future.
But they weren't abolished for existing prisoners, and with the sentences being indeterminate rather than fixed term, hundreds are now stuck in the system, unable to get a date for their release. Well, Dame Anne Owers knows more about this than most. She's the former prisons inspector, former IPCC chair, and is now the national chair of the Independent Monitoring Boards. Anne, good morning.
Good morning.
For those who are hearing about IPP sentences for the first time, can you just explain how they came about and why they still exist?
Well, they came about because ministers at the time decided that they wanted to be able to imprison people, not just for what they had done, but for what they might do. And we've not done that before, and we've not done that before for a very good reason, because we imprison people on the basis of the crime that they've committed, not the crimes that they might commit in the future. So that they created a large range of offences, over 150 offences, for which in combination you could be sentenced to this indeterminate term in prison. And they would set what's called a tariff, which is the minimum period that you have to spend for purposes of punishment and deterrence. And thereafter, you'd only be released if the parole board thought that your risk had been reduced. And having been released, you could be recalled at any time if you were thought to be risky.
Yeah.
So that was the consequence of it.
And you mentioned, there were quite a broad range of crimes that you could be imprisoned for. I mean, can you give us an example of somebody on one of those sentences? Because I was reading your report. I mean, one of the things that shocked me most was a 40-year-old who was given a tariff of 1 year, but is still in prison 17 years later.
Absolutely. And there are people, because you could be sentenced for a public order offence, for criminal damage, for theft, for things that wouldn't, we have life sentences. We have always had life sentences ever since capital punishment was abolished for very serious offences like murder and at discretion for serious offences of rape. So we've had those. But this extended that way beyond the range of people that indeterminate sentences were meant for, without, of course, the capacity properly to manage them through the prison system or afterwards.
And some of those people now, again, in your report, somebody was saying, somebody on one of these IPP sentences was saying a mandatory life sentence would have been kinder because they end up in prison alongside people who may well be getting out in a matter of months. Their mental health suffers, their quality, they have no quality of life, essentially. And these people have been left there because there have been calls for the government to re-sentence these prisoners. And so far that has been refused.
It's very interesting that everyone who's ever looked at them there thinks that they were a terrible idea. As you say, Lord Blunkett, who introduced them, Lord Clarke, who tried to reform the system, very senior judiciary. One of the judges in the Supreme Court described them as the greatest single stain on our criminal justice system. So nobody is now out there in defence of these sentences. But the question is what you do with the people who are still there. When I was Chief Inspector of Prisons, we produced a report on those prisoners in 2008. And we said then that although there had been some reforms, the crisis of IPPs had a long tail. I said then there are thousands of prisoners already in the system who will feel the consequences for a long time to come. That was 15 years ago, and we're still looking at those consequences.
And in fact, I believe that after the most recent call for something to be done about this, for the government to re-sentence, after the government said no, there have been 3 suicides since that in the months following. And you believe that those people may well have been impacted by that decision?
Well, we know that there were 3 self-inflicted deaths within a month of the government turning down the Justice Committee. And just to be clear, the Justice Committee is not saying we should let all of these people out. What the Justice Committee was saying, there should be a very, very organised, very, very precise resentencing exercise involving experts, involving senior judges, to look at what we need to do. And also that we need to invest more in the support for those prisoners, both when they're in prison and very crucially after they're released. But you're right that we know about 3 self-inflicted deaths within the month immediately afterwards. We think there may have been more, because what we're finding, what our boards are reporting to us, is that these feelings of hopelessness, of what's the point, and prisoners' mental health being severely impacted by it. And of course, there's the risk when you do this that you increase the vulnerability and the risk of those prisoners just because of those feelings of hopelessness and mental health concerns.
I mean, I'm sure anyone listening to this will feel, deeply shocked that people are killing themselves now because they have no way of getting out of prison. So the big question really is, what's the roadblock? What is stopping the government from doing something that it sounds like almost everybody else believes is the right way forward?
I think there is a concern about how you would manage those people who are, as you say, very vulnerable and maybe at risk to themselves or others. So there needs to be a system that resources this. There is now an action plan which is better than the previous one. It's got some accountability, it's got some senior involvement to it. But what the Justice Committee also asked for was this resentencing exercise of looking at why those people are still in prison, what needs to happen for them to be able to be released, what their risk currently is, and that's and the resistance to it. I wonder whether the resistance is getting less, because it was interesting that in the last debate about this, the current Secretary of State did say that he was going to have another look at the Justice Committee's recommendation. And that's the first time that I've heard those remarks from a senior minister. And so it may be that we will see movement on this, and that would be extremely welcome for those in prison, for those in prisons who are trying to manage the risks and vulnerabilities of those men and women.
As you say, Alex Chalk has said that, but so far we haven't heard what he's going to do. Do you think there is a political problem, which is that most of the time politicians talk about tougher sentences, clamping down on crime, and they simply don't want to be seen to be reducing the sentences that people are serving?
I think there certainly is that, and there is this sort of arms race, isn't there, on sentencing, which has involved both governments. I think there is also the risk of a minister being personally blamed for something that goes wrong, and so ministers tend to be very defensive about this. And one of the things, for example, that we are very worried about at the moment is that for those prisoners serving indeterminate sentences, the best route out of prison is to spend time in an open prison, and that is a sort of in-out bit that means that you can manage that sometimes quite difficult transition into the community. You can manage the risk to the person to their release and so on. Since ministers took responsibility for making those decisions rather than the parole board last year, far fewer of those prisoners have ended up in open conditions, because the risk then sits with the minister rather than sitting with the parole board. And if you're a minister, you simply don't want to take those risks.
And the second problem, of course, may be that we know the court system is overburdened as it is, and presumably resentencing thousands of IPP prisoners would take up a lot of resources.
It needn't take up a huge amount of resource if you managed it properly and you had your expert panel there. But I think the other side of this is that the other bit of the system, which is under immense pressure at the moment, is the prison system, with a rising number of prisoners, which means that IPP prisoners, like others, can't get to the right place to do the right course that they need to get released at the right time. So that they're causing and suffering from a hugely overcrowded and pressured prison system, which just means that they're often sitting in the wrong place to be able to convince anybody about their release.
Yeah. And can I ask you finally, I mean, you said, you've been in and around the prison system for a very long time. What would it mean to you, to those involved, I suppose, to see this issue finally wrapped up and sorted?
I think it would mean a lot to the integrity of the system, apart from anything else. And as I say, everyone who's looked at it thinks it was a huge mistake. It should never have happened. We should not be sentencing people for what they might do in the future. So I think it would, as Lord Brown, who was a Supreme Court judge, said, it would remove what he considered to be one of the greatest stains on the criminal justice system. It would also relieve individuals who are sitting there losing hope day by day, and it would also remove one of the pressures on an extremely overburdened prison system.
Dame Anne Owers, thank you very much indeed for joining us.